There is a book that no species in the galaxy has ever seen in its entirety. It has no pages, no ink. It rests on no shelf. It is a web of debt as old as civilization itself, woven across 1,000 worlds, and those who control it call it simply the ledger. And it has written every favor, every loan, every time a species on the brink of extinction reached out and begged for help. And next to each name, a debt not measured in gold, measured in centuries, in worlds, in entire generations born already in debt. Humanity signed that book 1,000 years ago, on the worst day in our history, and for 1,000 years we believed we could never repay. This is the story of the day we discovered we had been reading the book backwards. To understand the debt, you have to understand the creditors. They were called the Vorr. They were not warriors. They weren't conquerors. They were something far more patient. They were bankers. For eons, the Vorr made the galaxy their business. Saving a species wasn't charity to them. It was an investment. And the Vorr always collected their investments. Tribute. That was the word they used. A species saved by the Vorr paid tribute for centuries. Resources. Entire worlds surrendered. Generations of their people sent to serve on the Conclave's factory worlds. And if any species refused to pay, the ledger had a column for that too. 14 species throughout history no longer existed. Their names remained in the book, crossed out, as a warning to anyone who dared to think that a debt to the Vorr could simply be ignored. Humanity entered that book 1,000 years ago. It was the winter that nearly wiped us out. A shower of asteroids split the skies, dust blocked the sun, and Earth began to die. Crops rotted. The oceans cooled. Fewer and fewer of us remained. And then in orbit, a ship appeared that wasn't ours. The Vorr. They offered us salvation. Technology to clear the skies, to warm the world, to survive. And they extended the contract. What does a species do when the alternative is extinction? Sign. We signed. With trembling hands, with the last breath of a dying civilization, we signed each of the 1,000 clauses without reading a single one. We survived. And for 1,000 years we paid. And paid. And paid. Always believing that this was the only story the book could tell. 1,000 years later, when the Vorr came to collect again, humanity didn't send a general. He didn't send an admiral, a hero, or a soldier. He sent an accountant. Her name was Adira Sol, Earth's Auditor General. She wasn't imposing. She didn't raise her voice. She had the kind of calm that comes from someone who spends their life among numbers, where nothing is an opinion and everything, absolutely everything, can be verified. The Vorr looked at her and saw a civil servant. An insignificant bureaucrat from a debtor species. It was the first mistake they had made in 1,000 years. The debt collector arrived with a fleet. His name was Appraiser Corvith, the voice of the Vorr. The one who put a price on worlds and sealed the fate of species with the same indifference with which one closes an account book. He stood before humanity and read the sentence without looking up from his register. The debt is due, Corvith said. The payment is as follows. Half your population transferred to the Conclave's factory worlds. 3 of your colonial worlds surrendered in their entirety. Finally he looked up. You signed. Now pay. Or you'll be erased, like the 14 species that refused before you. Silence fell over the room. Corvith waited. He knew that silence. He had heard it 1,000 times on 1,000 worlds. It was the silence of a species that understands it has no way out. But Adira Sol didn't kneel. Adira opened a folder. And with a calm, clear, almost cordial voice, the voice of someone reviewing an invoice, she replied. Of course we'll pay, Appraiser. She turned a page. Humanity always pays what it owes. That was never up for debate. Corvith nodded, satisfied. Another species that understood its place. I only ask one thing, Adira added without looking up. Grant us 48 hours. To review the accounts. To make sure we pay exactly what is due. Not a penny more. Corvith almost smiled. He found it charming. Touching even. The little accountant wanted her books to balance before the end. 48 hours, he conceded. What difference does it make? The debt isn't going anywhere. Corvith agreed. It seemed like a trivial gesture. A courtesy. 48 hours changed nothing. You see, those 48 hours were the most expensive thing a Vorr had ever granted in 1,000 years of history. Because no debtor species, not a single one in 1,000,000 years, had ever done what humanity was doing. We were about to finalize that contract. We were going to read it. To understand what Adira Sol did, you have to understand something about debt. Every debt has 2 sides. What you owe, and what is owed to you. For 1,000,000 years, the Vorr had counted on one thing, that no species would ever read the entire contract. And why would they? When a species is paying to survive, it doesn't audit its savior. It obeys. The Vorr had built an empire of 1,000 worlds on a single bet, that no one would have the cold-bloodedness to sit down and read the fine print. They had never met a human accountant. While the entire galaxy waited to see humanity raise the tribute, tear half its people from their homes and surrender their worlds, Adira Sol did something that looked nothing like a surrender. She sat down. She sat down with the Vorr contract. The 1,000 clauses. 1,000,000 years worth of legal text, written in a dead language that no debtor had ever bothered to translate. And she began to read. Hour after hour. Clause after clause. As the 48-hour clock ticked, Adira didn't muster a single soldier, didn't load a single weapon. She only read. And sometime in the early hours of the second day, buried in clause 819, written in a paragraph that no one had opened in eons, she found it. A single line. A line written so long ago that even the Vorr themselves had forgotten it existed. Written when the Vorr were still honest before greed ruled them. Written when they still cared about appearing just. It read, "The lender is liable for all damages caused." Adira read that line. And then she read it again. And the accountant, who never raised her voice, who lived among cold numbers, felt for the first time in her life that a number could burn. Because she knew something the Vorr had forgotten. The Vorr's ascension technology, the same technology they sold to dying species, was never perfect. For 1,000 years, on dozens of worlds, that technology had poisoned atmospheres. It had sterilized oceans. It had left generations sick, worlds broken, and species that survived extinction only to live mutilated by the cure they were sold. And according to their own contract, their own fine print, their own forgotten promise, for each of those damages, the Vorr were responsible. Each poisoned world was a debt they owed. Adira didn't tell anyone. Not yet. Instead, she did what she did best. She opened a file. One for each damaged world. One for every dead ocean, for every shattered atmosphere, for every species mutilated by Vorr technology. He documented. He calculated. He tallied. And to that silent work, to that weapon made of pure accounting truth, he gave a name. He called it the Nemesis Protocol. Nemesis, the goddess who punishes not crime but arrogance. He gathered the evidence from every world across the galaxy on a single ship. A discreet, unarmed vessel that traversed space collecting testimonies and records of 1,000 years of damage. The ship was called the Scales. Because that was exactly what it carried. The weight of one side of the ledger, about to tip onto the other. And the entire operation, the audit that a handful of humans launched against the oldest financial empire in the universe, was given the simplest and most lethal name, Operation Clear Accounts. But a secret the size of a galaxy is hard to keep. And appraiser Corvith began to suspect. Something was wrong. I could feel it. The debtor species was too calm. There was no panic on Earth. No caravans of people preparing for the factory worlds. No weeping. Only silence. And work. Corvith didn't wait until the deadline. He sent inspectors to Earth with a clear order. Find out what humanity was gathering. And therein lay the real danger. Because if the inspectors understood what Adira had in store, if they discovered that humanity wasn't gathering tribute but evidence, the Vorr would have wiped us out that very night. Contract or no contract, they would have destroyed us as they had wiped out the 14 species before us. The inspectors toured the records offices. They stopped right in front of the files for the Nemesis Protocol. One of them picked up a file. He opened it. He saw columns, numbers, names of worlds. And he saw exactly what he expected to see from a debtor species, terrified. Someone counting with trembling hands everything they were about to lose. He didn't realize he was actually looking at everything the Vorr were about to pay. He closed the file. And left. They never knew how close they had come. At dawn on the second day the deadline arrived. Appraiser Corvith returned to the Great Hall of Species, triumphant. His fleet filled the sky. He had come to collect humanity's oldest debt, and to do so in front of the entire galaxy as a lesson to the other worlds. And there waiting for him was Adira Sol. Alone. Without an army. Without weapons. With only a folder under her arm. Corvith looked down at her, with the infinite patience of a banker who has never ever lost. Do you have the payment, accountant? And Adira Sol, for the first time in this whole story, smiled. You're right about one thing, appraiser, she said. The accounts don't lie. That's why I brought mine. Corvith thought she was talking about humanity's debt. She wasn't talking about humanity's debt. The great hall of the conclave hadn't seen a day like this in a million years. 14 creditor species on their thrones. Hundreds of debtor species below in the stands, brought to witness the lesson. What happens to those who owe the Vorr? And at the center of it all, an entire fleet in the sky and a single human being standing on the ground. Adira Sol walked to the dais. Not the debtor's dais, the low one, the one for the damned, where 1,000 species had pleaded before her. She walked to the creditor's dais. The high dais. The one for those who get paid. A murmur rippled through the hall. No one had told her to. No debtor species had ever stood in that place. It wasn't forbidden, because no one in a million years had thought to try. Appraiser Corvith frowned. But he let the little accountant have her moment of theatrics. What did it matter where she stood, if the result would be the same? Go ahead, Corvith said. Present humanity's payment. Let the whole galaxy see it. Adira Sol opened her folder. And she spoke, not with fury, not with fear, but with the calmest voice that room had ever heard. Before presenting anything, appraiser, I want to make something clear to everyone here. Corvith tilted his head. We Vorr have no debts, accountant. We are the ledger. And Adira at last smiled genuinely. I know, she said. I read it all. Adira Sol raised her hand, and the ledger unfurled across the conclave hall. But not as the Vorr always displayed it, that endless column of debtors, of crossed-out names, of subjugated species. She showed it in its entirety. For the first time in a million years, the other side of the record saw the light. The Sarn world, ocean sterilized by the Vorr ascension reactor. 3,000 years of damage. Adira turned a page. The Telhu world, poisoned atmosphere. For generations born sick. She turned another page. The Morim. The Veil. The Osca. 41 worlds, appraiser. 41 worlds you saved, and then shattered. She looked up at Corvith. And you are responsible for every single one of those damages according to your own contract. I did the math, appraiser. The numbers don't lie. Neither do yours. The Vorr are not the creditors of this galaxy. They are its greatest debtors. For the first time in a million years, appraiser Corvith was speechless. He stared at the figures spread across the room. The Vorr debt. A sum so colossal that no empire, not even his own, could ever pay it. This is absurd, he managed to say. That contract is a million years old. No one invokes forgotten clauses. No one reads them. And Adira replied with that terrible calm. That was always your mistake, appraiser. You built an empire on the certainty that no one would read the fine print. You never counted on anyone doing so. You don't destroy a banker with fire. You destroy him with the truth. Adira turned to the entire hall, toward the hundreds of indebted species in the stands, those who had spent centuries paying tribute, and declared, with the simplicity of someone closing an account book, for breach of its own contract and before all the species gathered here as witnesses, the Vorr conclave is hereby declared bankrupt. Its debts exceed all its possessions. Its assets are seized. Your fleet is being held as collateral. And all the debts you claimed are cancelled. Because a creditor who cannot pay their own bills loses the right to collect those of others. The silence that followed was absolute. The species in the stands looked at each other, absorbing the words. They were free. One of them stood up. The Ish, the most indebted of all, those who had paid the longest and most dearest than anyone else. Their representative descended the steps, crossed the entire hall, and stopped in front of Adira Sol. She did not kneel. The Ish had spent 1,000 years on their knees. Never again. She extended her hand. For 1,000 years, the Ish said, no one read the contract for us. No one could. No one would. You read it? For everyone. What kind of species does that? And Adira Sol, the accountant who never raised her voice, took that hand and replied. The kind of species that pays its debts. And collects those owed to it. The ledger still exists. It remains that web of debt as old as civilization, woven across 1,000 worlds. But something changed that night. The Vorr called it the ledger. The eternal debt. The chain no one could break. We changed its name. Now we call it the Book of Clear Accounts. And for the first time in a million years, it is balanced.